Welcome to Trek Talk. This is our first episode, and subbing for Troy Harper today is Associate Professor in the Communications Department, Mr. O'Brien Stanley. Glad to have you on the show.
Glad to be on board.
Thanks for subbing in for Troy today, and I am Matthew Kahn. Today we're going to start off with our first show, talking about the history and the evolution of Star Trek. Now, Star Trek's been on for well over 30 years now, or close to 30 years rather. And it's come from a very modest, low-budget, B-rate sort of television show, and then has worked its way up to this grand subculture that has spanned not only the United States, but many parts of the world. The kind of thing that we're going to start off today with is just kind of starting out talking about where the origins of Trek came from. Where did the ideas come from? How did it build from such a almost kind of a cheesy cornball space western and somehow evolve into this grand ideal of the perfect human future? I guess the best place to start off would definitely be the classic Trek episodes from the mid to late 60s. 72 episodes starring William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, and later also we had other characters that came in that became big parts of the show. Walter Kuening became Ensign Chekhov, and he started out as a regular, became big. And we had Sulu's character, who was a recurring character, George Takei, and he ended up becoming a regular crew member. But I watched a lot of these episodes on tape, and I missed a lot. But I know that you're a really big Trek fan, and so maybe you probably know a little bit more about the original Trek than I do.
Well, I was old enough to have been there when it aired. Yes, I remember Star Trek being on, but I have to admit, and this is an admission. When it was on, I was about 8, somewhere in there, 8, 9, 10. And I never could quite get the beaming thing. I thought only aliens could do something like that. And I knew they weren't aliens, and I knew it was a good ship, but I have to admit, I watched a lot of Lost in Space back then. But having said that, let's move on to the history of Star Trek.
Yes.
Star Trek did catch my imagination when I was in the 8th grade. I'd come home from school, and every day at 3:30 was a classic Trek episode. And that was back in the 70s when there was no hope of a new show coming on. No one knew the movies were coming up, and we're going to talk about those a little later. But I did love the old shows, and I watched them over and over. And really, one thing we're wanting to do with the show, and in talking about the show, is connect in future episodes to different departments around Lamar. And one thing that really hit me was this is going to make a connection with writing and English and also with communication, was the writing of the show. And later on, as I began to see more the episodes over, and you could kind of judge them again and be a little more analytical, more critical, I realized the writing was uneven. And there's some excellent books also where you can learn about writing through looking at Star Trek. David Gerald has written an outstanding book called The World of Star Trek, where you can really learn about writing and looking at writing as you look at the old Star Trek episodes. But to go back to the history, where it all began, one book I read last year, and I've seen these two gentlemen, it's a book that Robert Justman and Herbert Solow wrote, and it's about the very beginnings of Star Trek back to 1962, 1963. And they talked about how Desilu got involved, and it's a fascinating story. Desilu was a kind of sleepy studio. Their main job was to put out the Lucy Show, which was essentially a sitcom on film with 3 cameras, running multi-camera, but it was all film. Not a whole lot of staying late, not a lot of sets, pretty simple sets, everything's down pat. They'd been doing it for years. And then all of a sudden, somehow they got the notion, let's see if we can do a couple of different shows. And they shot 2 pilots in 1 year, essentially. It's maybe a span of maybe 16 months. But the Mission Impossible pilot and the Star Trek pilot were being shot at the same time. And both connected with Desilu. And Herb Solow and Robert Justman talk about just the beginnings are fascinating. They had to shoot the original Star Trek pilot The Cage, I believe, with, who was the first Captain Pike? Who was
Captain Christopher Pike.
And what was the actor's name?
And that was the late Jeffrey Hunter.
Exactly, exactly. When they shot that, that was in an old studio that they had to take the mothballs. I mean, they were wasps flying around. They hadn't used it in a long time. The lights were old. And I remember another thing they had a tremendous problem with audio, because you'd have the sounds of the rats running around, the sounds of the wasps, actors getting stung, and it delayed the production of The Cage. But it was a fascinating pilot. It ended up being a very cerebral, interesting pilot. And as you know, it was too cerebral for NBC.
Oh, yeah.
They said, no, too much thinking involved. Hey, Gene Roddenberry, what about this wagon train to the stars that you promised us? This isn't it. But we liked it well enough. They did a very rare thing. They commissioned a second pilot. Usually you get your chance to make your splash, and if you make it, you're on with the series with the pilot, and if you don't, you're not. But they made a second pilot, and this time he stayed true to the wagon train to the stars, and with Where No Man Has Gone Before, the second pilot. And by that time, William Shatner became the new captain of the Enterprise, and Jeffrey Hunter had decided that the show wasn't theatrical enough for him, and he decided that his career would be better off if he didn't become a captain, which is one of those not necessarily good career moves that you could make. And because William Shatner certainly rode the wagon train to the stars very, very far. And but the series was a terrific series, the classic Trek. Once they got it up and rolling, the first season, what's interesting, kind of comparing, you're going to compare Next Generation in a couple of minutes, but the first season was by far the best season with classic Trek. You had the writers were concerned with science fiction. They got science fiction writers like Robert Bloch. Oh gosh, the most famous one, City on the Edge of Forever. Who wrote that?
Oh man.
Okay, we'll come up with it in a minute. It's our first show.
Don't remember that one.
Fantastic series, and I'm going. And there's some people out there going right now.
Yeah.
Anyway,
we should know that one. We know.
But fantastic episode with an excellent science fiction writer who can be ornery at times. He's got a reputation. The guy that wrote City on the Edge of Forever, anyway, has a reputation for being ornery, but still, nonetheless. They worked 18-hour days easy, put in 6-7 days a week to make this work, to get the sets. They had to have new sets all the time. The entire setting was set 250, 300 years in the future. Just tremendous amount of work in getting that going. And the funny thing was, what was killing them was Desilu also, Mission Impossible got the go-ahead. Their pilot succeeded. And sometimes it's like one of those things where sometimes you get what you wished for and maybe you shouldn't have made that wish. Desilu all of a sudden had the two single most difficult to produce TV shows going both at the same time. Because Mission Impossible had high production standards, an excellent show.
Yes. And
no set location. The furthest thing from the Lucy show you can imagine. Every location's different. A new country every week. And so they both had these shows that were just tremendously hard work, and there was a lot of burnout involved. Oh, yeah. But the first year they stayed up there, got the job done. Second year was a little uneven. I think maybe they took it a little bit easier when you look at and they had to. They had lives, they had families, and they had to take it a little bit easier. The third year, just to be brief, because we've got to sum up the history of Trek in a short period of time, but the third year they felt like they weren't coming back. Gene Roddenberry decided, when the second year wasn't so good, Gene Roddenberry made a commitment to NBC, and he said that I will come back full force, work the 18-hour days, the 20-hour days, make this work, but we've got to have a good time slot. And they thought they had Monday nights at, I believe, 7 or 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Central. I think they thought they had that time slot. But it turned out that they got the Friday night at 10 o'clock Eastern time slot, which back then was the worst time slot you could possibly have. It was the death knell for most shows. And Gene Roddenberry saw the handwriting on the wall. He said, I've got to keep on working as a producer, so he went to work on other projects. Now, the interesting thing is that for years, Gene Roddenberry was kind of regarded as just about almost being a god within the Star Trek universe, that he never would have done anything wrong. The history of Gene Roddenberry was that he never did do anything wrong. Well, this book by Herb Solow and Robert Justman, went into that some, and they pointed out that a whole lot of other people worked very hard on Star Trek. Without Gene Roddenberry, it could well have never gotten going. The idea wouldn't have started. But they pointed out that a lot of people were behind the scenes working incredibly hard to get it going. And they pointed out that the other people were willing to stay, even with the Friday 10 o'clock time slot, and they had some terrible budget restrictions. NBC gave them less money instead of more. Instead of keeping up on inflation in their budget of buying props for every episode, they had less to buy with. And less to buy with, terrible time slot, but there were other people that were willing to stay and work the 18-hour days in the hopes that it could get going. And a giant letter writing campaign had saved Star Trek to go from second to the third season. In the book, they pointed out, they kind of demystified that a little bit. They pointed out that a little bit of that letter writing campaign lives in myth. A lot of letters did come in, but apparently Gene Roddenberry commissioned a lot of those letters to come in, apparently. But nonetheless, I think NBC did see the letters. They renewed it, but unfortunately, the energy wasn't there for the third season, and it, without a doubt, unlike The Next Generation, whose third season is probably its strongest, the classic Trek's third season was really not its strongest at all. The worst writing, worst special effects, and really it all starts with the writing. I mean, worst writing. But they even had such things as invisible ships in the show. You were talking about that, where you're supposed to see in one episode. What's the name of that? Do you remember the name of that episode, Matt? The third season one. It'll come to us. We'll get unrusty.
We'll think about it.
But anyway, in the didn't mean to throw that at you, but in the third season, there's an episode where there's an alien out in another ship, but you never see a ship because it's invisible, and it's real convenient to have it invisible. That way, they didn't have any money for models at that point.
Make another ship.
Exactly.
Right.
So
and you can also notice that starting with the third season, they reuse a lot of the matte paintings, a lot of the sets. They converted some sets that they had used maybe 2 or 3 episodes before, and they would convert them to another room on the ship, or they would convert a cave that they had used before in one episode and make it the underground dwelling place for the miners in the episode with the Horta.
That's true.
Use the same matte paintings in the background, and suddenly we're looking at the exact same set, the exact same place, but it's really not the same planet. So it kind of leaves you with that deja vu feeling, which really kind of heightens up the whole budget problem.
Right, and they were so infused with energy in the first season. They wanted it multicultural. They hired their stand-ins, the extras. The extras on the set, the people you'd see walking in the extra big hallways of the Enterprise, they always made them nice and big, but they were stuffed full of people. It was multicultural, multi-ethnic, and by the third season, you may have seen a couple of Caucasian people, and that was it.
Right.
You're wondering, how are there 430 people on this ship?
Right, you never see them. They must all be asleep.
Exactly. That was another big lack. But and of course, one thing that you never did see was a restroom on it. I think well, that's a good segue to get to The Next Generation. And Matt's going to take us from the days of classic Trek. And of course, it went into reruns. After it was canceled in 1969, went into syndication. It was a huge hit in syndication. When it would run at 6 o'clock at night it made little UHF stations with weak signals. All of a sudden, if they had the Star Trek reruns, they were beating out the news in Houston.
Oh, yeah.
And so all of a sudden, it became very popular in syndication, which got Paramount's eye. And between bathrooms and catching Paramount's eye, I'll pass it off to you for the next version of Star Trek.
Well, the next version of Star Trek actually kind of an interesting thing about it was once it came into syndication, Paramount around the early to mid 70s decided that they wanted to make their own television station, which is now the UPN network.
That's right. That actually happened.
That is spreading out across the nation. They're gaining new stations all the time, and they wanted a flagship series for their network, for their television network.
And what year is this, man?
This was in the early 70s.
Like 74, 75?
74, 75, early to mid 70s. They really wanted they really wanted Star Trek to be their flagship series for their new Paramount Network television network. They approached Gene Roddenberry and they told him, we'll give you the prime time slot, we'll give you an extremely large budget, we'll give you brand new sets, you can bring back all the actors, we'll renew all their contracts. They were going to bend over backwards to bring Star Trek back and make it the flagship for their new network. And the series was just titled Star Trek II. And it was great. The sets were great. They got in with some really great writers, and also got into a whole new technical aspect of Star Trek that really wasn't present during the original series. You had a lot of techno jargon, but they used the exact same props, the exact same pieces for every little thing they wanted to do. If it was some kind of servo-actuated correcting device or something, you'd see it the next time as some kind of modified phaser in a different episode. Well, they kind of corrected all this with new writing and with a whole bunch of new technical ideas for Star Trek II. They improved all the sets. They did the multicultural blend. They hired more actors of different ethnicity, and really were getting ready to take the whole thing off with a shot. And they were going to actually replace William Shatner's character and Leonard Nimoy's character. William Shatner's character was going to be a recurring character as an admiral who would come off and on, just whenever they needed him. Leonard Nimoy did not want to go back to Trek. He did not want to be classified as Spock for the rest of his life.
I am not Spock.
I am not Spock, the title of his book. And for the longest time, he really hated to be kind of put in that category as just you could only be Spock. He really hated that. He wanted to branch out. So he told Paramount that he would come on for the first few shows and that they would eventually write his character out and they would bring in another Vulcan character. Well, a week before they were getting ready to start shooting and get everything together, Paramount came to them and told them that they had canceled their plans for a television network and put they had already had contracts with everybody, entire sets were already built, the shooting schedules were together and everything. Everything was put into mothballs, all the actors were sent home. So they sat with these sets in their warehouses, completed sets. They sat with actor contracts, didn't have a clue as to what they were going to do.
I can remember this period of time because I was in high school, and any rumor you'd have of potentially a new Star Trek coming out would spread like wildfire.
Oh, yeah.
And I can remember just discussing that in high school, and then all of a sudden nothing happened. And I can remember hearing, of course, that was back then when there wasn't so much. You had your main broadcast networks, and there wasn't all the entertainment news where you could really find out what was going on with stuff like you're talking about.
Right.
And so bottom line, what inspired Paramount to take a new step with Star Trek?
Well, the thing that really got Star Trek off into the next step, which was the movies, was George Lucas and Star Wars in 1977. Prior to 1977, if you made a science fiction film, studios automatically knew that they were going to lose money off of it.
Right.
There have been many blockbuster films that had come out before. Everybody remembers Silent Earth. Forbidden Planet with Leslie Nielsen. I mean, a lot of really great classic science fiction.
2001.
2001: A Space Odyssey as well. But the earlier classic ones from the 50s, absolutely no profit made. Well, with Star Wars when it came out, totally changed everything. Everybody wanted to get into science fiction. And who better to get into the science fiction arena than Star Trek, who more than 10 years earlier had a television show that just captivated everybody on syndication. So they took all the episodes and all the sets that they had made for Star Trek II, put it into Star Trek I, got Alan Dean Foster to write a terrific story to bind everything together and really carry everything over, and you had the Star Trek movies that started. Now, all the fans that were out there watching the old episodes in syndication just jumped right on. The first Star Trek movie, $109 million in the box office in 1979.
That's true, even though it's the merits of the movie, how good a movie it is, it will be the subject of an upcoming debate.
Yes, yes.
But nonetheless, so even though it wasn't necessarily, and a lot of fans were a little disappointed with it. Everybody can nitpick that movie. There's good things about that movie and bad things about that movie. But what was interesting, I know what you're saying. What was interesting is the repeat viewership. It made money. It cost a lot of money, but it made money.
It made the money
and
back.
launched the movies.
And that's what kept Star Trek alive from the 70s right up until the Next Generation started.
Aha, Next Generation. Let me help you segue there. I just throw in my 2 bits on it. We're running a little short. We're running a little short on time, but I do know just from reading that book, Robert Justman came back, and I saw him in Houston at a Star Trek convention. He's fascinating, really interesting man. He was an associate producer for Star Trek, but he came back. Gene Roddenberry wanted him back on board for the Next Generation in 1986. And David Gerrold, who I spoke of earlier, the writer that wrote The World of Star Trek, he came on board for that first year. A lot of people kind of came and went in the first year. There was a lot of turnover in the beginning of the Next Generation. But obviously, the movies, and by then, more outlets for television were there. Syndication was becoming more and more popular by the mid-'80s. So you had syndication, you had a successful run of movies. Everything was there for Gene Roddenberry to come back, including some of the old hands to come on board and help him out.
Right.
So first show was in 1987, Encounter at Farpoint was their pilot? Okay.
87 or 88. I don't remember the date.
87.
I don't remember the year exactly.
You know why I remember it well? Because I taped a bunch of them because I thought, okay, I was into Lost in Space the first time around. I'm going to be here the second time around. This is my chance to catch them live and record them. So,
well, the interesting thing about it was when they came back and they started with the Next Generation.
Right.
They basically rewrote a lot of the episodes from the original series, and they also took a lot of the episodes that they had written but never done for Star Trek II. That was the entire first series, and actually a good part of the first season, and a lot of the second season was also a lot of scripts that they had written for Star Trek II that they just modified and pulled over because they were already there. They had a big pool of stories to run with. The most interesting concept, actually, was the shifting characters. They shifted. They had a whole array of new positions. They had a brand new ship. They had new technologies and a lot of new techno jargon, which really seemed to be one of the popular mainstays of the Star Trek series. Was all of the technical aspects, the laws of physics, how they broke them, how they overcame them, how they kind of bent them a little bit so that they could move the stellar fragment away from the planet to keep the plates from tectonic activity, and all the different techno babble that went on through the show really seemed to grab most of the really die-hard Star Trek fans, and it pulled a lot of new people into it as well.
That's true. I think the technical part was interesting. They were in the Next Generation. Although the funny thing was, to contrast against the classic Trek, their first season was their worst instead of their best.
Right.
Generally viewed as their worst. I remember I defended it. There were some shows I liked, but it get called the boring generation, and I can see why. The first season it really was slower. They had to hit their marks, learn to hit their marks, and get the show formed better. But about the techno jargon, I think you're right. There's a lot of interest in that. I also like the writing too, especially as the series developed. Now I'll let you take that. Yeah.
Right. Especially once towards the end of the second season, the beginning of the third season, you really start to see more storylines. You can kind of tell that the storylines from the first 2 or 3 seasons, they were really clinging on to the original series Trek.
Right.
I mean, it just had that feel to it. Anybody who had watched both series, you could really tell. They were clinging on to it desperately. But by the second and third season, they were on their own. They were developing their own storylines. Everybody's character was developing individually, which really set things into motion to make it a great series, almost, or actually, in my opinion, even better than the original series in the fact that they developed the main characters, and even introduced a few new characters, which later transferred over.
And the merits for the which series is best will be the subject of an upcoming battle it out, winner take all, which Star Trek is best, which series is best tournament that we're going to have in a tournament form a little later. Well, Gordon has given us the 3-minute warning. And I will say real quick, before we get to where you're going, but what episode best do you think, in that period of time, personifies, puts everything together about what you're talking about in terms of the writing? Is there one that you have in mind?
I can't think of one right offhand. There's so many good ones that.
Well, since I asked the question, I had one in mind.
You have one in mind.
Real quick, the one where after the Borg, the 2-part episode with the Borg, where Captain Picard comes back, and he's got to take a week to recover. He's been transformed into a Borg, the worst enemy they have, a half cyborg, exactly. Cyborg. And he became one of them with mechanical implants. And he had to take a week in France to recover. Captain Kirk would not have, Captain Kirk would have needed a certain amount of recreation and then moved on. But we'll just leave it there. But I thought that was really neat. That made a real difference between the captains.
Yeah.
Okay, I know where you're going. We need to wrap up, Matt. What's a new idea for the show?
One feature we're going to have on the show for everybody who's out there is the ship's log. This will enable you, our viewers, to give us some inputs and some ideas that you might have for future episodes. Maybe if you have a question that's always really bugged you, something about Trek that you've always wanted to ask, could never really find an answer about, send it to us. We'll do your research for you. And
we'll do our best.
We'll do our best to find out, really. And then we can let you know.
Also, comments on the show?
Comments on the show, anything. Anything you want to tell us, we've got our address on the screen that you can mail us at. That's Lamar University, courtesy of the Department of Communication, Box 10050. That's here in Beaumont. Also, you can email us. We have a Hotmail site. If you're connected to the internet, you can email us at trektalk@hotmail.com.
And we'll be taking email when we get to this battle of the shows. We're even going to have a battle of the captains.
Right.
We want your input. You guys are going to be the ones to decide which captain moves on and which captain doesn't in our tournament.
As well, we're going to do that also not only with the captains, but we're also going to do it with which series you think was better, original, Next Generation, DS9, or Voyager. You have your pick. So get your pros and cons together, think about it, and then drop us a line. Let us know.
All right. I guess it's time to move on.
That's about all the time we have for this show. I want to thank Mr. O'Brien Stanley for coming on the show with me today and subbing for Troy. Thank you very much. And look for us on our next episode. We're going to be talking about the 4 different ships shown in the different series.
What's a good line to end us with here, Matt?
Oh,
as we go to music.
Good line.
Could do live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper is probably a good one to end off the first show on.
Make it so.
You can do the little Vulcan signal.
I'll do like Captain Kirk. He always had trouble getting his fingers to... Okay. There we go.
Thank you for joining us today, and have a good day.
These are good books, man.